All right, in this video, we're going to be finding percents of numbers mentally, because many times it's useful to be able to estimate a percent of a number mentally. And there are a couple strategies for doing this. We can always use the percent proportion, but sometimes it's nice just to be able to find a percent or to estimate a percent mentally, to do so quickly and on the fly. And one of the strategies we're going to talk about in this video is to use the fraction equivalent of the percent, or we can use some benchmark percents that are easy to compute mentally. There's a lot of percents that are very, very easy to find mentally, and we can use those to find other percents of numbers. So here I have a table of percent and fraction equivalents. Many of these you probably already know. Some of these would be very helpful to have memorized so that you can use fraction equivalents when you're trying to find percents of numbers. So I've got a couple of examples of how to use the fraction equivalent when you're finding percents of numbers mentally. So here I have an example of finding 75% of 24. So again, we're finding the part. So we want 75% of 24. 24 is the whole, and 75% is 3/4 as a fraction. 75 100ths is 3/4 in simplest form. So really we're finding 3/4 of 24, which is a little bit easier to do mentally, because 1/4 of 24 is 6. So 3/4 would be 6 times 3, or 18. So we can use the fraction equivalent to help us find percents of numbers. Next one, find 66 2/3% of 21. Well, 66 2/3% is 2/3 as a fraction. So really we're finding 2/3 of 21, and 1/3 of 21 is 7. So 2/3 of 21 would be 14. So a couple examples there of just using the fraction equivalent to find the percent of a number quite easily. The second strategy would be to use benchmark percents. And by benchmark percents, I mean percents that are relatively easy and quick to do mentally, and then using those as building blocks to find other percents that might not be easy to find mentally. So these are the 4 that I usually recommend that you have memorized, that you can use to construct other percents of numbers. We all know 50%. 50% of something is very easy to find because it's half of the number. 50 out of 100 is half. So 50% is easy to find. If we can find 50%, then we can find 25% as well. 25% is half of the number, or in other words, 1/4 of the number, or you just take the number divided by half and then divide it by half again, and you've got 25%. Also, 10% is very easy to find. That's 1/10 of the number, or in other words, divide it by 10, or move the decimal one place to the left, and you've got 10% of the number. So 10% is very easy to find. And just like 10%, 1% is very easy to find. 1% is 1/100th of the number, or divide it by 100, or move the decimal 2 places to the left. And you can find these percents almost immediately, very easy to find. So I have a few examples here of how to use benchmark percents to find other percents. So find 60% of 90. Well, 60% is not one of our benchmark percents, but we can use benchmark percents or combinations of benchmark percents to find 60%. One way that I found 60% would be to find 50% of the number, and then find 10% of the number, and then add them together. So 50% of 90 is 45, and 10% of 90 is 9. And if I combine those together, 50% plus 10% gives me 60%. So 45 plus 9 is 54. So 60% of 90 is 54. So again, I use these benchmark percents to find that. Or maybe another way that might have been a little bit easier would be just to find 10% right away. 10% is 9, and 10 times 6 is 60. So 9 times 6 would give me 60% of 90, which is 54. So 2 different ways to come up with the 54 as the 60% of 90. So really you have a lot of freedom here to find these percents or these combinations any way that you really want to. Those aren't the only 2 ways to get 60%, but just 2 very common ways to do that. Next example, find 3% of 122. Well, 3%, I don't know how to find 3%, but I can find 1% relatively easily. 1% is 1/100th of 122, or just move the decimal 2 places to the left. So 1% of 122 is 1.22. So if I just triple that, that would give me 3%. So if I take 1.22 times 3, which is pretty easy to do mentally, I get 3.66. So 3% of 122 is 3.66. So again, using benchmark percents to find other percents, using combinations, and then find 35% of 40. I can use 25% because 25% is 1/4 of the number. So 1/4 of 40 is 10. And another 10% onto that would give me my 35%. So I used a combination of 10% and 25% to give me a total of 35%. So 10 plus 4 then is 14. So that gives me 14 is 35% of 40. So again, you can see or start to see how many different percents we can actually find mentally just using these 4 major benchmark percents. So here we have an application of that. A $750 TV is on sale for 15% off. What is the total discount? So here we need to find 15% of $750 to find out how much is going to get taken off of the price. Well, I'm going to use a combination of benchmark percents. I'm going to use 10% and I'm going to use 5%. Now, 5% was not one of our benchmark percents, but hopefully you can see how you can get 5% if you need it. Well, 10% is $75 because that's 1/10 of 750. And then 5% would be half of 10%. So I just take half of the 10% that I found. Half of 75 is $37.50, and then I add those two together to give me a total of 15%, which would be $112.50. So $112.50 is going to be the discount on this TV. So I could go ahead and subtract that from the price to find out how much the sale price is. And then sometimes we don't need an exact answer, and when an exact answer is not needed, we can just simply estimate. We can estimate by rounding to the nearest easiest percentages to find. So again, I stuck with the benchmark percents strategy. That's one of my favorite ways to do it, but by all means, you could use the fraction equivalents as well. So estimate 92% of 50. Well, I'm going to think 90% of 50, so I'm just going to estimate to get close, and I use the 10% benchmark to find that. Well, 10% is 5, and if I just take that times 9, that would give me 90%. So 5 times 9 then is 45. I also could have used the 10% benchmark and just subtracted it from 50. So 100% of 50 is 50, and if I take away 10%, that's going to give me 90% as well. So we can use subtraction as well as addition to find percents as well. So 2 different ways to get to 90% there. 10% times 9 or 100% minus 10%. Again, there's a lot of freedom here in estimating these, so I'll leave that up to you how you like to do that. Next one, estimate 63% of 205. So here I just kind of rounded these to the nearest multiples of 10. So think 60% of 200. And to get 60%, I did 50% and 10% combination. So 50% of 200 is 100. 10% of 200 is 20. And then if I add those together, I get 60%, which is 120. So 63% of 205 is about 120. Next one, estimate 130% of 91. So think 130% of 90. Well, here we're going above and beyond 100%. So 100% is probably the easiest percent to find besides 0%. 100% of 90 is 90. That's all of it. So now I'm going to add another 30% to that. So to get the 30%, I took 10% times 3, which is 9 times 3, which is 27. And then I went ahead and added those together. 100% plus 30% is 130%. So 90 plus 27 gives me the 30%, which is 117. So again, estimating with percents or finding percents mentally, we can use fraction equivalents, or we can use those benchmark percents, which are very easy to find mentally.